Oh, okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Nargis Kasyanova. I'm director of the program on Central Asia here at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And we're very happy and honored today to welcome, or to be more precise, welcome back to the Davis Center, Dr. Eren Tasar, who is associate professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of History at UMP Chapel Hill. And he's our alum. He received his PhD in Soviet history in 2010 from Harvard, where he studied with Professor Terry Martin. And we're very happy Terry is here with us today. And Eren is the author of the widely acclaimed Soviet and Muslim, the Institutionalization of Islam in Central Asia book, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And I brought with me
Smack it over my head? Or
yes, Eren's PhD dissertation, which for some reason is kept in my office, in the office I share with two other people, but here it is for nostalgic reasons. I brought it here. And Eren will talk about his current project, Muslim atheism in Central Asia, and it's the result of a brief but lively encounter we had with Eren on the sites of ACES convention in Philadelphia, when Lior and me were perusing the book exhibition, and then we ran into Eren and we had like a lively chat for 10 minutes, and Eren told us about his project, and we both thought it's fascinating, and why don't we have Eren here for a book talk? And well, it is a fascinating topic. In the teaser, you kind of had a bit of an idea what Eren will talk about, but basically, the book argues that the Soviet atheism in Central Asia became something different. Got a life of its own in Central Asia, and let's, without further ado, let me give the floor for a presentation.
Well, thank you, Nargis, so much, and let me assure you, the honor is all mine. It's just been such a bittersweet experience. Traversing the haunts of my youth, the storied corridors. And I'm grateful to all of you for coming here. I'm grateful to Liora for your hospitality and the Davis Center for having me. And I'm grateful to my advisor, Professor Terry Martin, without whom I wouldn't be here today. Now that I run a pretty big graduate program, I can appreciate just how absolutely unqualified I was to be admitted to this program. And that confidence that Professor Martin had in me is something that still keeps me going, and that I try to repay in part by trying to do good original work, which is where this project is coming in. The talk today will run about 35 to 40 minutes, just so you're all ready. And after that, I look forward to your feedback. This is the first time I've really talked about this project substantively off the UNC campus. So I'm eager to get your feedback about it. In Central Asia, the decade and a half following the Second World War saw the highest levels of religious freedom in Soviet history. Displays of piety returned to public life in a visible way just about everywhere. At the same time, across the 1950s, an increasingly acrimonious dispute crystallized between hardliners and moderates in the party, culminating in the defeat of the moderate line and the beginning of Nikita Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign in late 1958. In the context of an explosion in religiosity largely left unchecked by authorities, the absence of a clear religious policy from on high granted the few writers willing to write on atheistic topics unprecedented flexibility to target religion in a manner of their choosing. Muslim atheism, in its first experimental, most interesting incarnation, was born. Anti-religious writing, which had come to a complete halt during the war, experienced an uptick starting the early 1950s, and especially after April 1954, when the party issued a decree on the poor state of anti-religious propaganda. These publications, however, almost entirely emanated from Moscow. In Central Asia, such publications were apparently rare. The paucity of publications offers a stark contrast to the situation within the Council for the Affairs of Religious Cults, whose internal correspondence is most massive and most detailed in the 1950s. The contrast raises an important point of context. The genres in which one could write about religion for the reading public in the Soviet Union were circumscribed, even in the best of times. It is perhaps not surprising that anti-religious literature, especially the large component of it written in Muslim languages, should acquire a religious meaning in the sense articulated by Alan Frank. Elements of Soviet secularism could become objects of Islamization. In today's talk, I would like to introduce the 2 completed chapters of a book I am writing entitled Muslim Atheism, which I will complete by the end of this year. The 4 chapters of the book will be dedicated to the 4 decades spanning the 1950s to the 1980s, with an epilogue discussing the 1990s. This medium-sized book will be around 100,000 words, or a bit over 300 pages in length. The 2 chapters written so far, that is the first half of the book, are dedicated to the 1950s and the 1960s. Over this period, I argue for the emergence of a space, atheistic literature that was distinctly Islamic and Soviet. I conceptualize this space in terms of a triangle formed by 3 nodes: hostility, texture, and silence. If I could have the next slide, please. And I realize this is a really uninspiring slide, but to my credit, it took me about 20 minutes to put this together. That's how bad I am with tech. The works I analyze in this book are not mere condemnations of religion. What makes them examples of Muslim atheism is their engagement with some combination of these 3 nodes. Hostility, representing the greatest continuity with writings of prior decades, amounted to rejection of religion. Writers of the 1950s perpetuated the Marxist-Leninist line that religion constituted an emanation of class relations and that vestiges of religious life in the Soviet Union could only be accounted for in parts of society relatively unaffected by communism. This normative template did feature some subtle shifts across the decade. Writers of the 1950s largely abandoned the once common claim that Muslim clergy were in cahoots with the USSR's foreign enemies. It would not be revitalized with respect to Islam until the 1980s, while engaging much less with the question of belief than their anti-religious predecessors of the 1920s and 1930s, shifting their focus to practices. But in the 1950s, something new was afoot. Atheistic literature became a medium, not just for criticizing religion, but for documenting, describing, and educating readers about it. The second of the 3 nodes lacked precedent in the annals of Soviet atheism. I refer to it as texture, detailed accounts of Muslim beliefs, practices, figures, and institutions as they existed in Soviet Muslim communities. With time, the node of texture came to incorporate what I term a catechismal aspect, including original interventions into Islamic history encompassing the history of early Islam and the Islamization of Central Asia, as well as extensive discussions of Islamic law. Inadvertently, perhaps, atheist writers contributed to a repository of what Paolo Sartori has called Muslimness, an emic notion which encapsulates the embodiment of intellectual traditions, beliefs, and reflections on being Muslim as a religious and moral subject. For Sartori, Muslimness, captured by the Uzbek term Musulmonchilik, which exists in variation in all Turkic Muslim languages, is a category deployed by Muslims themselves. Atheist writers, and I am sure their readers too, would have objected to the inclusion of the texts treated in this book into the category of Muslimness, as the present discussion indeed does. Yet I want to suggest that this is just where the texts belong, not only because they form part of the archives of religiosity, but because hostility toward religion in overt and subtle forms was an integral part of the lived experience of Soviet Islam. A corollary of texture is the 3rd and most enigmatic node characterizing the texts of the 1950s, silence. Atheistic texts leave out a lot of information one might reasonably expect in works on religion. Yet silence amounts to more than omitting information. It is active, not passive. Both the damage caused by Stalinist anti-religious repression and the extent of religiosity among the Muslim population largely remain unmentioned. Thus, the note of silence creates space for atheistic writers to articulate Muslimness inadvertently or deliberately in an anti-religious medium. In today's talk, I will discuss only 3 of the sources analyzed in my 2 chapters, one from the 1950s and 2 from the 1960s. These sources offer examples of the articulation of three core characteristics that I associate with Muslim atheism. The first is an eschewal of categorical judgments about Islam. While our authors have harsh criticism for certain Islamic practices, they display no apparent sensibility for which practices should gain traction in their stead. Muslim atheism lacked not only a clear audience, but a clear argument. This was no accident. All atheist sources spoke of a departure from religion as both a fait accompli and a desirable goal. Yet, with a few exceptions, such as fasting, which atheist authors uniformly rejected as harmful, they never outlined what exactly Muslims were purported to have abandoned or should be departing from. The second characteristic relates to texture, various pieces of ethnographic, historical, or other evidence and material related to Islamic history, dogma, or practices observed by Soviet Muslims. These various pieces, when taken together, amount to an avalanche of information about Islam and Muslims. The signature characteristic of a Muslim atheist is his or her use of a far greater quantity of texture than is necessary to criticize the Muslim practice, belief, figure, or institution under discussion. What I call this sphere of documentary obligation preoccupies our authors to such an extent that they frequently lose sight of the anti-religious critique they're supposed to be making. Texture in the hands of a Muslim atheist distracts from or drowns out these anti-religious arguments, which lose their clarity and significance as a Muslim atheist discussion progresses. The third characteristic relates to the casual and indeed lazy engagement of these authors with centrally promulgated Soviet atheism. If our authors deploy vast quantities of texture when discussing Islam, then by contrast, they deploy what I will in the third chapter probably call anti-texture when discussing ideas and initiatives hatched in the Institute for Scientific Atheism in Moscow. The source base for this project consists of around 100 books, articles, pamphlets, and dissertations written in 7 Soviet Turkic languages, with some Russian and Tajik sources as well. The sources I employ in the book's first 2 chapters are overwhelmingly Uzbek, though they incorporate one source each in Bashkir, Russian, and Tajik. Although my later chapters will include sources in other Turkic languages, it appears that Uzbek was far and away the most popular Islamic language for atheist publication. My sources consist of texts published by central publishing houses in the 5 Republican capitals, as well as unpublished materials. Sorry, I got pages all mixed up. Such as ethnographies and dissertations that I found in various collections in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. I believe the materials at my disposal reflect only a fraction of the atheistic literature written in languages employed by Soviet Muslims. There are also entire categories of material I do not include, such as newspaper articles, though these are referenced in some of my texts, and materials published outside of Republican capitals, if there were any. I do not believe Muslim atheism emerged in the early 1950s as the result of some conscious or organized policy. It represented instead a response to the chaos confronting religious policy and atheism with it in the decade following the war. During that decade, atheists were at a distinct disadvantage. The impressive infrastructure of pre-war organizations such as the Godless Society seems to have vanished overnight, while mosques, if not madrasas, appear to have weathered the 1930s much better than has previously been supposed, at least judging from the figures provided by the latest Uzbek scholarship. Perhaps more importantly, the party's call to renew atheistic work was not accompanied by specific guidance. The result was a period of experimentation featuring apparently little in the way of censorship, as authors grappled with ways to convey their critiques of Islam to a Muslim audience. In the 1950s, the star example of what I am talking about is Muhsin Aliev's 1958 book, The Islamic Faith and Its Rituals. If I could please have the next slide. I will spend a good chunk of time talking about this book, which happens to be my favorite. It is an avant-garde work, unlike any other work of atheism published before it. Aliev's book merits sustained attention because it sets the agenda for much of the atheistic literature that followed. It is likely the most overtly anti-Islamic work to appear in the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1958. And paradoxically, it is the most informative text about Islam and Muslim life to be produced in the Turkic language in that period, at least legally. Little information is available on the circumstances behind the book's publication or the author's background. It was produced through a collaboration between Pravda Vostoka and Red Uzbekistan in 15,000 copies, a very large print run for that decade. The author was a scholar of literary and film studies who published pamphlets and books throughout the 1950s and 1960s. He leaves little reason to doubt the sincerity of his loathing for Islam. In line with Marxist-Leninism, Aliev describes the version of Islam both as an expansion of the tribal cult of the Meccan elites and fundamentally a reflection of the oppression of the ruling classes, serving the interests of the feudal and commercial elites. Elsewhere, the author is less empirical. Both the past and legacy of the Muslim faith are Black. Aliev even takes the highly unusual step for a Leninist of citing a rare reference by Marx to the Quran, made in relation to the Crimean War. The Quran and the Sharia it is based on divide the peoples of the entire world into two equal parts, Muslims and infidels. Islam preaches damnation for non-Muslims. Aliev enlists Russians too. He cites Chernyshevsky's opinion that everything in the Quran stems from stupidity or disgrace. Figures as diverse as the conqueror of Tashkent, Mikhail Chernyayev, and the anti-Bolshevik Ataman Dutov are presented as pro-Muslim, with the latter exhorting a Basmachi leader, "May God and his prophet Muhammad give you madad," that is divine assistance. The book's structure is stranger still. Like other works analyzed in this first chapter, it is organized almost like a catechism or manual, not dissimilar to the structure, though certainly not the content, of Islam 101 style pamphlets Turkey's religious affairs presidency began publishing around the same time. Following the introductory historical overview, there are 5 sections covering prayer, celebration of the Prophet's birthday, Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr, animal sacrifice and Eid al-Adha, and the Hajj. Each section exhibits the 2 core features of hostility and texture, alternating between various modes of criticizing Islam and describing Muslim beliefs and practices in detail. Consider the first section on prayer, namaz, which begins with the claim that the 5 daily prayers were an innovation of the clergy. Quickly becomes difficult to tell if Aliev has embedded the texture within an anti-religious medium or whether it is the other way around. The Prophet Muhammad said, "I ascended to heaven. There I spoke with all the prophets. The Lord Almighty made it a requirement for all my people to perform namaz." Putting the Prophet aside, our author dismisses this quotation attributed to Muhammad as a fairy tale concocted by the Muslim clergy in the 12th century, suggesting that prayer was absent in the early days of Islam. We can already see here the author's unwillingness to criticize the Prophet directly, a nearly universal feature of Muslim atheist texts, one of which even goes so far as to present Muhammad as a progressive figure. But returning to Aliev, he goes on, according to the beliefs of the Muslim faith, people are considered slaves of the Lord Almighty. People who perform namaz regard God as a mighty entity. For this reason, Muslims prostrate themselves during prayer, diminish themselves, and make supplications to the Lord of heavens, God Almighty. Aliev then mobilizes 2 10th century polymaths, the author of the Shahnameh, Abul Qasim Firdausi, and the Sogdian historian Muhammad Narshahi, a Muslim atheist favorite, to remind readers of the early depredations of the Arab conquerors in Central Asia. As the anti-religious presentation of prayer continues along the same lines, the use of texture, Muslim beliefs and terms used by Muslims themselves to describe God and their relationship to him remains firmly embedded in a hostile medium. Then, however, Aliev concludes the section with a twist. If I could have the next slide, please. Commenting incorrectly that Muslims need at least 5 to 6 hours to pray 5 times per day, he estimates that billions of hours have been wasted since the 7th century. Simple-minded folk lacking scientific knowledge are forced to pray every day and listen to Arabic verses they do not understand. At this point, the author turns abruptly to the present. It has to be said that at the present time, there are very many people and youth under the influence of the Muslim faith who pray 5 times every single day. For this reason, many enterprises, collective and state farms and institutions cannot meet their quotas in a timely fashion. In the end, they do harm to the state, people, and themselves. For example, on the day of Eid al-Adha alone in 1957, 90,000 people among the population of Tashkent city and province took part in the holiday prayer. 17% of them were youth. The most important aspect of praying to God is the idea that the less you value yourself, the more likely your prayer will be answered. The one praying renders himself a lowly slave and beseeches God as a beggar. A Muslim prays to God in the hope of receiving compassion and mercy. Aliev, who has just devoted some effort to proving that prayer exists solely thanks to the machinations of the clergy, chooses to conclude his discussion with the observation that prayer is alive and well in the fourth largest city in the country. He takes care to hint, in fact, that it is becoming more popular. Aliev paradoxically conditions his entire text on a demonstration, not just of religion's presence, but of its dynamism and adaptability in socialist conditions. Embedding texture in a hostile medium is the central stylistic and structural device holding Islamic faith together. Aliev's legacy and his unwitting achievement is to make this device a requirement for any author writing on Islam in Muslim languages. Aliev keeps the data coming. In 1957, he reports, the Prophet's birthday, Mawlud, was celebrated by the unconscious and stupid part of the population at the behest of the clergy. 300 households in Margolon and Tokon, and 500 households in several districts in Namangan province. As for the requirement to give charity, the author goes out of his way to demonstrate that it has increased over the Soviet period. The strange selection of statistics begins with Stavropol, where we learn 150 Muslim households paid 325,000 rubles on Eid al-Fitr in 1929. Moving to Uzbekistan, the author charts a dramatic increase in 1948. The charity recorded for 150 households at the Shahrisabz city mosque amounted to 27 tons of wheat and 42,000 rubles. In 1957, the believers of the Leninabad collective farm in Sirdarya district, Tashkent province alone, gave the imam 3,000 rubles and 1,500 kilograms in grain. It is not just certain stupid people who fail to appreciate the reactionary essence and harm caused by Islamic rituals, but also some collective farm chairmen and village communists who are currently making it all possible. Thus, hundreds of sheep were sacrificed in Pavlodar province in October 1949. 600 sheep and goats were sacrificed in the collective farm named after Stalin in 1957, while a certain imam named Ashur in a village in Kashkadarya province relied on various tricks and ruses and the incompetence of the local leadership to cause 12,000 rubles in damage and donations. These sorts of stories will come as no surprise to anyone familiar with the vast documentation of the Council for the Affairs of Religious Cause. That documentation, however, was classified, as much of it remains today. Aliev is writing about this in print, in the censored public arena. Aliev's frequent alternation between descriptions of religion and condemnation of it creates a tension that is usually resolved with an emphatic final sentence confirming where the author's sympathies lie. It is perhaps unsurprising that the author concludes every discussion with an affirmation of his atheism. What is surprising is how long he sometimes takes to do it. Consider his expose of the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, widely observed in Central and South Asia and long condemned by modernists and fundamentalists alike. Aliev brings in the voices of hypothetical Muslims recounting their adoration of the Prophet. According to the legend propagated by Muslim writers, from his very first creation, the Lord Almighty has also established a light called the light of Muhammad. He has appeared in his mother's womb, not physically, but because of his connection to a pure power. Aliev then describes the significance of the Prophet's miraculous birth to ordinary Muslims. Rather than crying Inga, Inga, like any other baby when he was born, Muhammad has got on his feet and said, I am Muhammad, a proud voice. He has then ascended to the sky. Even if Muhammad remains in the heavens, he has remained informed about the welfare of the situation of his community and its adherence to the laws of Islam. Noteworthy is Aliev's employment of the Uzbek honorific plural to refer to the Prophet. This makes it clear that the legend is being recounted not by the author, but by a hypothetical Muslim. Who else would assert that had Muhammad not been created, then the world and universe would never have been formed from nothing? Or, the Lord Almighty took pearls and rubies from the blessed river of the universe and fashioned the soul of Muhammad out of them. If Aliev's attacks on religion are harsher than those of other authors mentioned in this chapter, then he almost compensates by rendering his hypothetical Muslims even more fervent in their devotion. Muslim atheist texts could become sites of religious meaning by embedding significant Islamic content within anti-religious frames that in some cases come across as a mere shell. Yet Aliev takes this potential even further by including information of undeniable interest and perhaps even utility to Muslim readers. The section on Hajj takes pride of place. If I could have the next slide, please. It is overwhelmingly anti-religious. The black stone, Hajar al-Aswad, referenced neutrally by other authors, becomes a source of disease. If even one of the Muslims kissing the stone has an infectious disease, thousands of Hajis get sick. The Zamzam spring and its holy water are similarly a source of disease. Without doubt, the Hajj has transformed into a source of epidemics, claiming thousands of victims. Aliev's discussion of disease suddenly transitions to anti-imperialism. In 1937, General Franco put 400 Muslims on a steamboat and sent them to Mecca. Upon arrival, they spread evil fascist propaganda among the Hajis. In his own day, Mussolini did the same thing with Hajis. Aliev then credits a Colonel Twitchell with leading the first delegation of American Muslims to visit Mecca for the Hajj in 1948. In the following year, Truman sent 200 Muslims on the Hajj, and in 1950, 10,000 people performing the Hajj were flown to Jeddah Airport for free, American airplanes. If there is one silence in Islamic faith, it concerns Soviet Hajis. In 1945, Stalin permitted a small group of officially aligned ulama, some of them NKVD agents, to make the pilgrimage, a concession advertised with much fanfare in major newspapers. The annual Hajj delegations permitted by the state ranged in size from 12 to 25 people per year, amounting to around 900 Soviet Hajis between 1945 and 1990. Though the numbers were small, the impact was large. Those permitted to go on the Hajj received massive donations from the population and often took gifts from Muslims to deliver to members of the Turkestani diaspora in Saudi Arabia. It is likely many of Aliev's readers digested his discussion of the Hajj with this context in mind. Aliev brings in detail about the Hajj, not from these Central Asian pilgrims, but from the account of Benkunsky, a pilot who apparently flew the Soviet Hajj delegation to Jeddah in 1954 or 1955. Next slide, please. While expressing shock at the throngs flooding the Jeddah airport, Benkunsky's tone never becomes polemical. Jeddah is 80 kilometers from Mecca, considered a holy place where only Muslims may set foot. People from every corner of the world come to Jeddah in very great numbers. Benkunsky takes care to note the organization of throngs of pilgrims. From here, the Saudi Arabian airline arranges for their transportation to Mecca. Of course, all of them are Muslim. Automobiles were arriving at our hotel nonstop, day and night. These cars were all teeming with Hajis. Aliev immediately corrects the neutral tone adopted by Benkunsky by changing the subject with no transition or explanation. It was a neighborhood where Mecca's prostitutes lived for 700 years. But one could suggest that for an atheist, the damage has been done. Through the tissue of negativity, exaggeration, hyperbole, tragedy, and raw offense, the author presents as the definite feature of the Muslim pilgrimage. Motivated readers could extract quite a bit of information about what was actually happening during the holiest month of the Islamic calendar. And while the pejorative commentary is justified as atheistic, it is, historically speaking, totally in keeping with the genre of Islamic literature devoted to Hajji's accounts of the pilgrimage, the Hajjnama, which often contains all the negative information featured in Aliev's text, and worse still. Perhaps more importantly, readers are presented with a precise picture of what they are missing out on. They have it from the horse's mouth, that Muslims from all over the world are descending on Mecca in large numbers, except from Central Asia. Aliev's mishmash of sources certainly does not qualify as a Hajjnama, but it presents significant objective information about the Hajj in a prominent, widely distributed publication. While critical of much of what they saw during the Hajj, Aliev's informants are not anti-Islamic and are left to speak for themselves with little interference by the author. Aliev's book could be seen as a précis for the Muslim atheist literature written during the next decade. The tumultuous 1960s witnessed a dramatic expansion in the quantity and variety of atheistic writing in Islamic languages, making it a true body of literature for the first time. This expansion afforded atheistic writers new avenues to reach out to Soviet Muslim audiences using language, categories, and material that they hoped would best convey their critiques of Islam to as wide a public as possible. Publishing opportunities abounded in comparison to the previous decade, while print runs increased too. The impetus for this expansion was Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign of 1958 to 1964. The party rejected moderation toward religion as an aberration of late Stalinism. The campaign itself was, as I have argued, an ironic component of de-Stalinization. In Central Asia, perhaps its most dramatic manifestation was an attack on major shrines, which were temporarily shut down. Concurrently, the party invested heavily into expanding atheistic infrastructure across the 5 republics, with a plethora of academic departments and institutes boasting personnel dedicated to atheistic topics. As atheism expanded, Muslim atheism expanded too, in a stunning array of directions. With respect to the cult of saints, this expansion is on spectacular display in what could be the decade's star piece. Next slide, please. Khwarezm's Sacred Places and the Secrets of Their Coming into Existence is an article that was published in a run of 13,800 copies in 1963, through the auspices of the Republican Knowledge Society in a joint effort by 3 newspapers. Though announcing at the outset that the article envisions exposing the secrets of holy places, in their preface, authors Abdullah Rahmanov and Sabir Yusupov acknowledge numerous academic sources, hinting to the reader this will be no ordinary attack on religion. In reality, it is the atheistic incarnation of the traditional Central Asian genre of the shrine catalog or shrine guide. In Central Asia, these were often embedded within the histories of individual cities, such as Sairam, Bukhara, Kokon, and Khojand. The article contains all the information one could anticipate from a work in that genre, from the locations of the shrines to the biographies of the saints buried there. To this, the authors add 2 new features: anti-clerical commentary and historical data and references apparently provided by the author's colleagues at the Khwarezm State Historical Museum. The authors dispense with formalities in the first 2 pages, quoting Lenin and referencing the 22nd Party Congress of October 1961. Then on page 5, they abruptly present us with this image. Next slide, please. What you are looking at is an example of a seal referred to as the 11 Ahmads, listing the names of important saints and jurists in Islamic history, all named Ahmad. In the center is the name of Hoja Ahmad Yasawi. The seals were distributed by sheikhs at shrines across Central Asia to pilgrims, often ill ones. Pilgrims were advised to read the names of the 11 Ahmads and thereby tap into healing energy from the saints. All the authors have to say in the way of explanation is that the seal comes from the shrine of a certain Sayyid Ota. They explain that the shrine's sheikhs write down purportedly sacred prayers to heal all kinds of illnesses. To make it easier for readers to understand, we have enumerated each component of the standard prayer. What the authors have actually done is to obligingly provide the names of the saints in Cyrillic script beneath the seal, making this medical prayer accessible to Soviet Muslims who could not read the Arabic script. With no explanation, the authors then move on to another shrine. In fact, the shrine of Sayyid Ota is the one site in the book that does not have a dedicated mini essay. The authors have not even attempted to justify their inclusion of the seal in the text. In contrast, the rest of the article follows a consistent structure. It is divided into sections, a larger one covering Khwarezm's major shrines, and a shorter one describing holy springs, lakes, and salt quarries. These are listed in the table above. Next slide, please. The authors devote a mini essay to each site, ranging in length from half a page to 3 full pages, following a specific structure. First, they introduce the shrine's locale and the saint. Second, they provide historical information about the personality associated with the saint or the absence of one. Third, they conclude by casting blame on the shrine's sheikhs, sometimes by name. Each essay encapsulates an attempt to manage the nodes of hostility, texture, and silence, with the latter consisting in tacit recognition that all these sites remain enormously popular. The authors go beyond merely describing each shrine. For lesser-known sites, they make sure readers know how to get there. Consider the following examples. The El-Kaz-e-Ashwan shrine is on the other side of the inner tower of the territory of the old bazaar in the city of Hiva. Shah-e-Mardon Baba, the purported grave of the Caliph Ali, lies in the middle of a large cemetery in the village of Badr Khan, a few kilometers further when exiting the Shah-e-Mardon gate on the outer tower of the city of Hiva. The shrine of Zohir Hoja Baba is located in an old cemetery on the major road headed to Ravik Lake, on the territory of the 40th anniversary of October Collective Farm in Hiva district. Another false shrine, Olo Hojapir, can be found in the Maibastan Mahalla of the city of Hiva, while Holy Springs can be visited in Hiva's Sercha, the village, on the old dirt road that goes through the Koshkoper district when passing Shavat and in other places. In one case, the authors indicate that interested readers can take the train. As for the Dargana Ota shrine, it is located some distance from Hiva on the banks of the Amu Darya, near the Dargana Ota train station on the Chodra-Khongarot train line. The work raises the question of what Muslim atheist authors were actually trying to achieve. Their discussion of shrine pilgrimage suggests that in order to expose the practice's falsity, they felt compelled, consciously or otherwise, to provide an overwhelming quantity of information related to Islamic history and culture. This characteristic, on display in every work I have examined, is all the more striking given the paucity of references to new atheistic ideas coming out of Moscow in the 1960s. As Victoria Smolkin has shown, this decade saw an important shift in Soviet thinking about atheism, which was increasingly identified as a social phenomenon. Religion, that is, was increasingly identified as a social phenomenon. The idea emerged of developing a new complex of socialist rights to replace religious ones. This idea had appeared earlier in Soviet history. It had not been a focus of atheistic writing, at least not in Central Asia. In the 1960s, I have located only one published work featuring any sustained engagement with new socialist rights. Next slide, please. Folk Holidays and Rituals is a misleading title for a work devoted almost entirely to the new socialist holidays the party was trying to inculcate. Its author, B. Yakubov, is identified as a candidate of historical sciences, though his text contains no historical information. Published in 1965 with a large run of 19,030 copies, this 47-page piece devotes only 5 pages to Islamic rites and rituals. What is interesting about the text is the division of labor between the atheist and the Muslim atheist, even though the Islamic material comprises only around 1/10 of the whole article. Yakubov's introductory section, entitled Harm of Religious Rights, contains the polemical language promised by its title, with references to illogical rights preserved within the consciousness of some people. Beyond this, however, Yakubov includes the texture that we have come to expect from a work of Muslim atheism. His attack on Islam is merely a concentrated iteration of what we have seen elsewhere. Thus, the Qur'an Tepe Mosque domlas and imams sent out 38 representatives to mahallas to collect money and gifts from the people. In 1958, mosques in the province received 540,000 som from the people on Eid al-Fitr. In 1959, it was 422,000 som, the old currency. The list goes on with references to prayer, names of the types of ceremonial bread served at specific festivals, the names of major shrines in Andijan and Fargana provinces, and the varieties of animals sacrificed on Eid al-Adha. Yakubov squeezes more information into his 5 pages, further underscoring the documentary obligation of a Muslim atheist, even when he is pressed for time and space. It is a required and defining component of the genre, regardless of length. This again is confirmed by the fact that so few of our authors pay any attention to the positive atheism that Smolkin has demonstrated was taking shape discursively in Russia during this period. Next slide, please. Socialist rights are the ostensible subject of Yakubov's book. Yet the remaining 38 pages of the text, offering an overview of new socialist holidays, present a different panorama entirely from the 5 pages dealing with Islam. The socialist material differs at a fundamental qualitative level from that on offer in the previous section. The discussion features texture of a kind, with one key difference. Its existence is attributed to the activities of state organizations, such as city and district Soviets, industrial and other workplaces, even the Andijan Airport Administration. Thus, the cotton holiday is celebrated in Karakalpakstan with horse riding, while the flower holidays observance in Namangan includes people fanning out into the most beloved parks. The author even includes the names of pieces performed at a concert organized by cultural institutions in Andijan on Flower Day. Despite the inclusion of such detail, the section's ambiance has a generic feel. Typical statements include descriptions such as films are shown, and various attractions, general interest sports, and fireworks are organized, and on the occasion of the cotton holiday, the streets and culture houses were decorated with panels, diagrams, banners, and slogans dedicated to highlighting the victories of the development of the cotton industry. These are generic descriptions featuring no emotional investment on the author's part. No less importantly, Yakubov never specifies that Muslims could not observe these holidays and religious ones at the same time. In the end, the various discussions comprising folk holidays and rituals leave an impression of indecision, vagueness, and lazy engagement with Soviet atheism, resulting from the piece's disjointed components. A brief critique of Islamic rites that deploys texture, an overview of new socialist holidays, largely trading in abstract references to seminars and other events, a discussion of new socialist practices that hints at their debt to the Islamic practices they are meant to replace, and a red-blooded defense of customs the author has identified as traditional. A reader of Yakubov's text could plausibly conclude that new socialist holidays are supplemental to religious ones, that new socialist customs could largely build on existing Islamic ones, and that many Islamic customs could probably continue much as before. If Khrushchev's religious policy had the effect of reducing the presence of official Islam as represented by the Muftiyate, its impact on Muslim atheist literature was the very opposite. That literature expanded dramatically, exhaustively examining long-standing areas of atheist interest, such as practices and shrine pilgrimage, while reaching out to new areas of inquiry, such as dogma and history. This expansion allowed the nodes of hostility, texture, and silence to take on new shades of nuance. Whatever the object of scrutiny, these texts flooded their denunciations with texture. Appearing as empirical evidence in support of an anti-religious argument, this texture drowned out that argument through the sheer force of its quantity and quality, reflecting as it did an investment of time, effort, and commitment by our authors. Next slide, please, the last one. One recalls Grendel's famous verdict on Beethoven's variations on a theme of Diabelli, in which Diabelli's theme has ceased to reign over its unruly offspring. Rather, the variations decide what the theme may have to offer them. Instead of being confirmed, adorned, and glorified, the theme is improved, parodied, ridiculed, disclaimed, transfigured, warned, stamped out, and finally uplifted. This is not atheism, but a mockery of it, though probably not an intentional one. The decade's greatest silence concerns the future. Muslim atheist writers do not advance any vision of what a society without religion would look like. To be a Muslim atheist is to be preoccupied with the present and the past. This explains both our authors' difficulty in arriving at prescriptive judgments on religion and their obvious lack of interest in atheistic ideas and devices promulgated in Moscow. In our texts, these devices have become nothing more than the spaces through which interesting textures are recorded and intriguing silences unintentionally conveyed. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eren. Let's open the floor for questions and comments. Okay, yes, Leora.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much, Mr. Tasar.
Thank you.
I think I had two main questions. One is about the national component of this, and one is about the linguistic. So it struck me in the image of the picture, the image of Mecca, the word used was Muqaddash Shahad, which is, of course, it's Uzbek, but it's also, they're both words of Arabic origin. So I'm wondering how much in writings on Muslim atheist writings, how much they were struggling with decoupling Arabic language origin words or Islamic words. Were they trying to invent Uzbek Soviet alternatives to existing terms? And the other question that I had was about the national component, because certainly Kazakhs are writing about this, Uzbeks are writing about this, and I realize that both mean there's more Uzbek sources. But I'm wondering if they wrote about things differently, because there certainly is a reigning conception in the Soviet era that I've seen of Kazakhs as being nomadic and therefore less religious. So is their genre of Muslim atheism different than say Uzbeks who are largely sedentary?
Can I add to that? I had this question along the lines. Sorry, maybe yeah. Was the kind of differences in how they were assessed, how they were viewed? Yeah, like Islam among nomads, former nomads, and Uzbeks, not only written by them, but whether they were seen like as a more progressive people because they were less Islamic and so on.
Yeah, thank you. Really great questions. And the book's not done yet, so I don't have all the answers. Half of it is done, and I wish I could have read all 200 pages that I have, because there's just so much great material, only a small component of which I'm able to squeeze into this book. Let me start out with the linguistic issue. So there was a lot I wasn't able to really include in this presentation. I really did. I wrote a couple articles in advance of starting this project. And I think I was guilty of starting out with a kind of linguistic determinism, which I've abandoned since, because I found a couple of Russian works that qualify as Muslim atheist in my sort of according to my metrics. And I actually cite two Uzbek works that do not qualify because they don't deploy texture the way I'm using it at any rate. On words like muqaddas and shahar, I didn't have a chance to get into this to the talk. It's interesting that they really go out of their way to use Islamic, even Quranic vocabulary. I mean, in addition to the fact that they quote the Quran very extensively, I didn't mention any of those works in this talk. So, the Quran wasn't published in any Turkic languages until the late 80s in the Soviet Union. The one version they had, which nobody could get, was the Krachkovsky translation in Russian, which most people weren't reading. A lot of people didn't know Russian in this time period. So if you look at the kind of language they're using a lot of Sufi vocabulary, and then they're using like catechismal, like sajda. The word sajda, which is a prostration in the 5 daily prayers, is a word they use both to describe prayer, but they also use Islamic words metaphorically. Like they use the word sajda, they use the word fitna, which means conspiracy or dissent, which is a very important term in Islam. So there doesn't really seem to be an attempt to promote like secular kind of, not yet anyway, it may be happening later on. They seem to be trying to use terms that they think people will relate to and will understand. That seems to kind of be what's going on. The national thing, the nationality is almost completely absent. Not really talking about it at all. We talked a bit about this before the talk. They're using this term Orta Osio, Central Asia. So they're talking about Central Asia as kind of a unit, a cultural unit, and not really specifying who goes into that. When they use words like Tajik or Uzbek, it's usually referring to practices like in certain parts of the Fergana Valley, for example. The one guy I had, the folk holidays, Yakubov, he does have a section where he talks about milli urf odablar, so national customs, but he doesn't really define what he means when he's talking about national customs. So he's referencing customs. I have a pretty extensive discussion about that in the chapter. He's referencing customs that are observed by virtually all Central Asians, like the custom of the wake, for example, funeral customs. So I mean, one of two things could be happening. One is that they're appropriating Central Asia as this kind of cultural identity. The other more likely explanation is they're using it in a sloppy way. They don't really have an incentive to figure out what that actually means for the purposes that they've set out for themselves. So, yeah. And that was true in the documentation on religion that I used in my book as well. Nationality was deployed in much the same way. When they spoke about specific ethnic groups, it was about specific practices. So to answer your question, the whole discourse about the poverty of nomadic religion, the inferiority, that's absolutely absent.
Okay.
I've got Kazakh sources for the 70s, so I'll bet they're absent there. I think a lot of these frameworks we have are old Tsarist frameworks that got recycled in the 80s. That's my hypothesis. About Kazakhs being poor Muslims, about women being the preservers, the custodians of Islam. I mean, I have some discussion about this, that it's completely absent during this time period. So that's probably going to be the subject of the chapter on the 80s, chapter 4. This is kind of setting the stage for the 1990s discussion about, kind of, on the one hand, Islam being impoverished in Central Asia as a result of communism, but on the other hand, Islam being this kind of civilizational identity, which is kind of a very 1980s concept that's getting circulated. So I haven't done the research yet, so I don't know what's going to be there. And as you can tell, I don't have all the answers because I'm in the middle of writing this thing.
Can I add a couple of questions?
Yes, please.
One is on kind of the relations between the center and the periphery, right? to what extent kind of this literature produced in Central Asia was supervised by the center, like to publish something like that with, I don't know, 15,000 copies, probably it should have been approved, right? Or kind of what was the procedure, right? Or I don't know if you know this, but did it have to get them, kind of an approval from Academy of Sciences or Council, the Central Council, Religious Affairs, whatever the name was, or it seems what you kind of were saying or hinting at is that there was a good amount of freedom on the ground, right? And whether this freedom kind of allowed for looser, kind of looser texts in a sense that, they are kind of maybe confusing, maybe the arguments are a bit strange, like mishmash, eclectic, right? So kind of less discipline than what was produced in the center. So kind of the center periphery. And the second question is, well, you're asking the question, what did they try to achieve, the authors? And on the one hand, it's it's an atheist propaganda. On the other, they give so much information, right? But it seems to be quite normal for the in the Soviet context, right? Like where atheist studies are the same thing as religious studies, right? So kind of to be an expert, right? You needed to be an expert on kind of religious affairs. So you prove that, you put it into the text. The same thing for studies of the West, right? You need to envelope it into, something that is against the West, but you kind of give a lot of information and people would read books that are denouncing the West, but actually to get information about the West. So it's kind of the tension is baked into the kind of this sort of knowledge production.
Yes.
Could I add to that question? Like a lot of the things you described are very ethnographic, describing the types of bread we eat is the best of the world. Is there a difference in the kind of ethnographic content or like methodology used in things published in like Radio Uzbekistan or Prompt of the East versus more like proper like academic, publications or presses, considering these people are like, people who are doing their scholarship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are all great questions, and I don't know that I have the answers. I'll probably need to find them to publish a book. Well, in terms of center periphery, I really doubt there's a document somewhere saying we'll go and produce Muslim atheism. So I mean, it's my kind of concept to try to explain something that I don't think makes any sense. Why are you including, like the description of what pilgrims are doing? Why are you including these images of the Kaaba, which will only be available in folk-produced kind of mediums during this time period? But my sense is, I use terms like freedom provocatively. I don't think it's really freedom. I think it's more delegation. My sense of what's going on is that this stuff is being delegated to certain people who are trusted. There seems to have been an academician who made his career in Uzbekistan named Abdullah Ortikov in the first half of the 1960s, who himself published some critiques of the Quran. I haven't been able to access any of his stuff anywhere. But in some of these texts, it'll actually show his name. It'll say such and such, supervised by Abdullah Ortikov. So that there seems to have been these people or these institutes who were trusted to supervise this material. And one reason I think that is the case is that I have a 400-page, it's kind of like a manual, which I'm not using for the book. I'm writing an article about it right now. So it's a manual. What it is, it's an edited volume. That's what one of the chapters in it is a chapter about religion and chemistry, which is where this thing I have here comes from. So this is a 400-page manual for use in pedagogical institutes. And it's the first actual full-length Uzbek book in Uzbek. It's produced in 1962, if I recall. And there actually the sort of texture is completely absent. There's no images, there's no statistics, there's no information about, there's no quotations from the Quran. There's information that is useful in terms of trying to reconstruct what it was like to be a practicing Muslim in Central Asia, but there's none of this kind of ambiguity. And they're not including any information where you scratch your head and you ask yourself, well, why are you including this information? How could this possibly help you if you want to convince people to not believe? And that particular book was produced by the Ministry of Education. It wasn't produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Law, which was one of the main bodies in the Academy of Sciences producing this stuff starting in the late 50s. And it wasn't produced through the Knowledge Society. So there you kind of have what I would say, that text is kind of it's kind of an establishment piece, giving you an atheism that is more recognizable. Even though there's also a lot of kind of stuff. So the kind of chemistry thing, or there's an article in there about how like children are conceived and that kind of thing. You'd never find that in these other texts that I'm using. So that tells me that there's kind of an autonomization going on in this time period. So it's not really freedom in the same sense. But yeah, it is striking that they could get away with a lot of this stuff. That's kind of the whole point of departure of the project, like what is going on here. And I'm sure the answer I'm trying to provide is not the only one there. I'm sure there are other interpretations as well. Part of what I want to do is not so much convince, but just to get these sources out there. They're remarkable sources. No one's looked at these, which I think is a shame. And there's just a mountain of it in these languages. It's incredible. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The thing about the sort of, you make a very good point that, one reason that in some of my other texts, they're describing Islamic dogma in so much detail, things about inheritance law and charitable endowments, and they're providing Arabic terminology. One of these is precisely what you're just saying, that to challenge religion, you need to present yourself as an authority who has that religious knowledge in the first place. They also cite stuff about the West, but the thing about the stuff about the West is it's all false. It's all, the infant mortality is high in the West, and there's unemployment, all that standard Khrushchev stuff.
I'm not putting them together, but I'm just saying how that's how they.
No, but the point being that the information about Islam is accurate, actually. So that's kind of the distinction, that if this were all false, right, like the stuff you can get in the Tatar stuff I looked at from the 30s, how Islam allows 12 wives and that kind of stuff, right? But they're going out of their way to present accurate information, which was not, like in the Uzbek stuff at least, is not the way they're describing what's going on. West Germany is their poster child for like a horrible capitalist society. And it's a bogus description of what's going on in West Germany. And they claim to be reading West German newspapers. So, I mean, so that I think is.
Yeah, but the reader has no way of judging the stuff on the West.
Maybe, but I credit
he does have.
But I credit these readers.
He does have a way to judge the stuff on Islam because they're they're there.
And that's the other point, that the authors assume that the reader already knows all this stuff, which raises again the question:
or is able to.
Why are you including all this information if the reader already knows? The other thing I'll mention is the Uzbek is literary Uzbek for the most part. It's high-level Uzbek. So this is written for the kind of people who could, which is not an easy language to get down. So whereas, the one Tajik book I use in the second chapter is not a literary book. It's really written down in a very, it's one reason I can read it. It's very, very simple kind of, whereas these authors who are writing in Uzbek, they delight in these like paragraph long sentences. That's one way you show, like in a Turkic language, that's one way you show your erudition by having sentences that are like this long. So like they're doing this kind of thing. So like Leo, even on the linguistic modernization front, they're like a bad example, right? They're using this Uzbek that is, I don't know what the term is for it. It's like a eruditional kind of showmanship Uzbek, which is interesting as well, which also tells you they're not aiming for the common man.
But to be fair, you could write paragraph long sentences in Russian too. That could also be a sign of your mastery of the language.
Sure, in any
That's
language.
not unique to your Turkic language.
No, but the other thing, in a Turkic language is you use Arabic vocabulary, and that's one way to show that you're educated, obscure vocabulary. So they're doing a lot of that. So they're enjoying it, clearly. I can't prove it, but I think so. They're having a good time, which is also, that's the kind of history I like doing. I don't like fire and brimstone, so it's a good fit for me. But I think it's genuine, and their enthusiasm is coming across to me. Maybe that's just me making it up, but I think it's there. Yeah, which is kind of cool. Because you wouldn't think, right? These atheists writing about religion, you didn't think they'd be having fun, but I don't know. Yes, please. Did you?
Oh, I already asked this question.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the ethnographic.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. So they're not ethnographers in any systematic sense of the term, but they're doing stuff that could be qualified as amateur ethnography in terms of including ethnographic snapshots of things that are going on. So the data is a part of that. But also these just lovely descriptions of festivals with the names of the, I didn't know they had these kinds of bread. I mean, these kinds of bread might not even exist anymore as far as I know. So it's this, it's like there's a very much I would say a material culture element describing the Suza as that kind of thing. So again, it is ethnographic in spirit, but without the ethnographic apparatus, which I think does come later on starting in the 70s and restricts a lot of what I'm describing. To be fair, I thought in the 60s, all this sort of freewheeling stuff would get shut down because of the institutionalization of atheism. And that's not what happened in the 60s, it expanded. Yeah.
And if I could ask another question, I know this also coincides with like a lot of foreign Muslims from the global south visiting Uzbekistan. Is there any evidence that we see like them getting their hands on this kind of stuff or learning about this stuff? Because it's directly contrasting like the image they're trying to, propose of the Sunni as a place that protects, Islamic life.
Yeah, I was telling Professor Martin that this manual I mentioned, which is 400 pages long, it includes this discussion about what the reasons for the preservation of Islam in socialist conditions, which is not something my texts here are dealing with. They're not interested in that question. And one of the reasons that is given, the primary reason that is given is all these foreign Muslims visiting Uzbekistan. And I wish I brought the quote with me. He says, all these foreign Muslims are coming and they're praying the Friday prayer. Thousands of youth are coming and watching them. This is actually, he credits as one of the main reasons that Islam has survived. Of course, the foreign Muslims are coming because the party wants them there. So he's not really criticizing Islam anymore. He's actually criticizing the party without saying so. So he's saying, look, this is great. It gives you some utility on the international front, but it's really kind of screwing us here at home in terms of our struggle against religion, which is not an argument I'd encountered before, even though I wrote about the kind of internationalization of Islamic policy starting during this time period. Yeah. And then, of course, the usual patriarchy, education, the clergy, the machinations of the clergy. Those are the usual standard reasons that are given for religion to survive. Yeah.
Was it exported? I wonder, this kind of literature to other Muslim areas? Like, I don't know, I'm thinking about Xinjiang, for example. Yeah, like my grandfather was communist and, like a bunch of other people were so anti-religious.
Yeah.
So clearly they consume something, some kind.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I was also telling Professor Martin that despite the 15,000 copies, they're not widely available. They're not in any, these sources are not available at the National Library in Uzbekistan. They're in the Library of the Academy of Sciences, single copies. So I don't know what became of all these materials. 15,000 might sound like a lot, but it's really not a lot if you think about it in a republic of several million people. So that also raises the question of, how widely were these?
Yeah, were they distributed?
And maybe that's why they could get away with this.
They were sold, or would you buy it in a bookshop?
That I don't know. That would be nice to know. Presumably, you could buy it in the main bookstore at the Academy of Sciences.
Is there a price?
Sometimes there is, yeah. I haven't recorded it. So just go back.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, these things were cheap, as you know. So,
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Or were they sending them directly to collective farm libraries?
Yeah.
Where people that might have also been, because the Knowledge Society had its own distribution channels.
Yes.
In which case, lots of people would have been reading them. So, yeah, Terry.
Oh, I just want, there's a lot of fun. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, what is your argument for why this was being produced? You're rejecting that it was intentional, although you seem to be flirting around with that thing subconsciously or that type of thing. And Nargis produced the other argument that came to my mind, right? That this is this is audience demand, and you're providing the audience with stuff that they want to have in a genre that allows you to do it. And that reminded me of some of the, I don't know, do you know Golubiev, the guy that did the material?
Yeah.
Book called
The Lies of Soviet things or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Yes, I do remember.
He's now working on the paranormal. And, one of the sources is Nanya. Because people, there's a huge demand for Nanya lectures on the paranormal. So of course you do a denunciation of the paranormal, but then in the question period, you can go on and on about this type of thing, which also then made me curious about Nanya in Central Asia and whether there's anything of that sort going on. But what is your argument?
So I think this was a task that was given to them to write about atheism in these languages. So if you look at the materials from the 30s in Uzbekistan, I was shocked by how much of it was in Russian, actually. So when you get these statistics about, well, there was hundreds of thousands of copies, the vast majority of it is a language nobody can read at this point. And the Uzbek stuff I found, including in Tatar stuff that's been, including the Tatar stuff, it's stuff that's been translated directly from Russian very often, or sometimes even European languages. So there seems to have been a mandate at some point to produce material that is actually authored in these languages that Muslims are reading to convey this critique. I think the argument is that there is actually no definition of atheism in a Turkic language, because the term that is used in the 20s and 30s, godlessness, is a taboo term. It doesn't appear once in any source I've looked at, including the thousands of documents I used. That term doesn't appear at all, even in Russian. So it's getting replaced with something else. So, if you think about it, I mean, it's kind of a unsurprisingly Soviet thing. They would say, go and spread atheism without actually providing a definition of what atheism is. It kind of jives with how I understand the Soviet Union, the cultural politics at any rate. So, in some sense, I guess the argument is this is their response to how do we define atheism, I guess. And they've been given the mandate or given the drive to convey an undefined atheism to the population. There's a lot of questions I can't answer though.
Right.
The audience.
But aren't you saying that the oddity is this very specific knowledge about this is the thing that surprised you, right? That there's this very specific knowledge about Islam that's being conveyed in the book.
And accurate.
And accurate knowledge that might be useful to practicing Muslim.
Well, that's maybe. Yeah, I can't prove that.
That doesn't have to do with the definition of atheism, does it? Or the definition of what a genre is.
Well, if we fast forward to the late 80s, we find some of my authors transitioning overnight into the role of sources of Islamic knowledge. Consider that in the 80s, they are engaging in joint publication projects with members of the official ulama. Then it kind of raises the question of, did atheism end up actually having this core religious component in Central Asia that it didn't have anywhere else? So I mean, that's not answering the question, but I think the problematic is, what is atheism in Central Asia? And the argument is part of it is Muslim atheism. Maybe that's not the whole thing, because I have texts that are not Muslim atheists, they're atheists. There's no texture at all. So there's no shades of nuance, shades of gray. So, but I think, I suspect the story is going to become less interesting in the 70s, because the texts I look at from the 70s, there is a lot of this sort of stuff that is coming from Moscow sociological surveys, this whole idea they come up with that Islam is divided between, traditionalists and modernists, all these kinds of stuff, things that are getting developed in Moscow, they're taking more seriously, they're dealing with them. So I don't know, I haven't looked at the materials yet, but I kind of think that's where it's headed. But the big question is not so much did atheism work, but what was atheism? I think in the 30s, the answer is pretty clear. I don't know if you agree with that, but it's pretty straightforward that atheism is disbelief and it's anti-clericalism. In this time period, the disbelief vanishes completely, and the anti-clericalism gets totally watered down such that it's almost absent by the end. So again, it raises the question, if you're watering those things down, and you're including all this stuff, what is atheism in Central Asia? It ends up being kind of this religious thing, I guess. I don't know. It doesn't answer your question, but I don't have the answers yet. Yeah, I'll have to come up with them. Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, Eren, on the question of permission for these things, I mean, you said Moscow kind of farmed it out to
That's my
Central
hypothesis,
Asia, I
yeah.
mean, they had these people that they trusted who, but in terms within Central Asia, was there a censorship? I mean, did the Mufti have anything to do with granting permission, or do you have a sense of how texts were permitted or not permitted in terms of publication?
You know, I was telling Lyra this morning, I don't know about the censorship. I don't know what the censor would have had to like have had for breakfast to like allow.
Yeah,
Like, why are you including an image of the Kaaba in a like, which is really, as a censor would know, in a book that is designed to discredit? Like, how does that help you? So, you know, being interested in like classical music, we were talking about this. You know, in a lot of these conservatories in the Republic, they were allowing, I mean, they were allowing you to play stuff like George Crumb that, you know, you couldn't play in Moscow or Leningrad. One wonders if there's a, you know, that you know, some of that stuff gets, it's not so much freedom, but one wonders if the censorship was applied more logically and more consistently to certain kinds of topics that were identified as really pressing. And then one wonders if atheism was not one of those topics. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the 70s and 80s with this literature. I didn't talk about the fact that the Muftiyate, I didn't have time to discuss the fact that the Muftiyate is very important in this literature. They cite the fatwas of the Muftiyate, they quote from them extensively. The Muftiyate's fatwas, these are advisory opinions the Muftiyate would release about various practices and that kind of thing, what's permissible, what's not permissible. The Muftiyate could not publish its fatwas. So when they're quoting like the entirety of these fatwas, they're actually doing a service to the Muslim population by distributing the fatwas or important parts of them in like 15,000 copies. So the Muftiyate is very, very important, both like as something that is directly engaged with, but also the practices they talk about in detail, like the wake practice, the taziyah, is a practice the Muftiyate devoted fatwas to. So the Muftiyate is there in the background as well. And it's entirely.
But in terms of formal censorship, you don't have a sense.
Well, the Muftiyate wouldn't have been in a position to censor. It's entirely possible under the table they went and asked the Muftiyate to look at this stuff. That wouldn't surprise me at all. Partly because, as I told Professor Martin, I hypothesized these guys were all relatives. That's what I suspect. I'd love to prove it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure these guys all knew each other. So, because they're clearly watching the Muftiyate very closely. And they know about stuff that's going on in places like Egypt as well. They're aware of that too. Yes, they're paying attention. So they're knowledgeable. They're not ignorant. Which again, you read some of the stuff about like from the 30s, and you know, they just, some of these guys don't know a lot about Islam. They're getting a lot of stuff wrong, actually. These guys make a point of getting it right.
I wonder how they learn about Egypt.
They might have learned about it from the Muftiyate. This was already a period when they were sending academics of Muslim nationalities as attaches, well, to Al Azhar, but also as attaches to Soviet embassies. You know, there were people from the Middle East, maybe not in Central Asia at this point, but certainly Russia. So I mean, there was an engagement there that people have written about, including me, I guess. So they would have had information about somebody like, you know, Shaltut, who I mentioned, who was the Grand Imam al Azhar, a close ally of Saddam, who was really the exemplar of kind of a progressive pro-socialist Hanafiism. So he was really somebody who the Muftiyate was paying attention to in particular. The point being that the vast majority of the anti-religious material in here could have plausibly been advanced by secular Muslims in other countries. Not all of it, but a lot of it, because they never actually say you can't believe in God, almost never. So they're really criticizing other stuff. Belief is no longer on the table. So I guess that's the central issue, or the central point of departure. Yeah. Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sorry.
How is the religious cult defined in the Soviet Union, and how close is it to the loose definition of atheism?
A religious cult?
Yeah.
Well, the whole notion of cult, is that a Napoleonic notion? I think that might be from a Napoleonic idea. The whole idea of it doesn't mean the word cult doesn't mean the same thing in Russian as it does in English. It's more of like a confession that has a built-in hierarchy. So, I mean, Marxist-Leninism obviously builds on this, is viewing a cult as not just belief, but it's a whole complex of beliefs and superstitions and monetary flows that make the entire structure of the religion possible. So they've got a very specific understanding of what religion actually is. And as Marxists, they believe all religions are the same. A lot of the authors make that argument in spite of themselves. They point out how like distinct Islam is, but Christianity. They try very unsuccessfully to show that orthodoxy is the same, actually, in some cases, in a very amateurish and lazy kind of way, because they don't know much about orthodoxy. So they have this very kind of very rigid, ostensibly rigid definition of what a religion is. The term cult, I think, is meant to capture that. Atheism, again, as I already mentioned, just doesn't get a clear definition. They're circling around definitions. So they're criticizing clergy, they're criticizing things like domestic violence and attributing it to religion or to the clergy. They're criticizing traditional healers, they're criticizing donations. So all these kind of stock critiques of religion are there and pretty unremarkable and unsurprising. But then in the whole point is that in most of these texts that gets drowned out by all this other stuff that is actually showing that, to me at least, that that's not really what a religion is. It's more than that. So yeah. Cult is not a word that gets used that often, though. There's no translation for it in Turkic languages, certainly. It's a Russian word. So that's one reason I don't see it very much. Thanks.
Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
It's ended with a musical quote from George Crumb. I was wondering if you had a sense of how traditional music persisted or did not persist, whether it was co-opted for purposes of nationalism, and what about the call to prayer?
Well, those are two really different things, the call to prayer and traditional music. I mean, I'm not an expert on music, certainly Central Asian music, but the whole concept of traditional music is a Soviet concept. So I mean, that concept wouldn't have really existed even during this time period. It's just music. It's they very often don't talk about music. They'll talk about the instruments that are. So that's part of the ethnographic detail. They'll mention the names of the instruments that are used only at circumcision festivals and wedding festivals, which are the two main ones, and commemoration festivals. So we wouldn't have music at those. I think I think there are scholars who could talk about that with more authority than I could, but I think the general sense is that this is something that obviously it's a continuing aspect of life cycle events throughout the Soviet period. It is something that never really gets attacked, to my knowledge, in any organized way. There are attempts to co-opt it. Certainly, when they talk about new socialist weddings, they very prominently mention the names of the instruments, of the traditional trumpets and drums and kinds of things. So they're proposing new socialist weddings, but they're not proposing new trumpets. They're not saying we should have like Russian trumpets or something like that. So, I mean, that's kind of there, but they don't draw a lot of attention to that. It doesn't seem that they view that as something particularly, as like a sore spot or anything like that. And your other question was about the call to prayer. So the call to prayer is recited orally at all official mosques throughout the Soviet period. They do get upset during Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign about them using loudspeakers to do it. But after Khrushchev is ousted, they restore the loudspeakers. So, and the other thing, because I have one report about actually the mosque in, where was it? October district in Tashkent. My wife's from Tashkent. She couldn't tell me what the name is now. Maybe it's Sabir Rahimov, I don't know. But apparently the mosque was right next to the Gorkon, the city district party headquarters. So the party secretary there thought that it was really outrageous that they were using a loudspeaker. He didn't say shut down the mosque. He said get rid of the loudspeakers, and they refused. He couldn't get the loudspeakers removed. But it's likely that, like in this period, there was still a fair number of places that didn't have electricity in this time period. So it's likely that in a lot of the unofficial mosques, which probably still outnumbered the official ones, for sure did, they were probably doing it just traditionally, hand to your ear and you recite it on top of the mosque. Minarets are not prominent in traditional Central Asian mosque architecture, actually. So the part of the reason they may have been able to get away with the loudspeakers is, there wasn't a guy getting up on the minaret for the most part. So maybe it was less. Like a lot of this, you think it's like, well, like if you want to attack religion, isn't it just obvious? Don't let that. And it wasn't obvious to them. That's what I find interesting. That's the compelling part of the whole study of Islam, which other people than me are engaged in right now. So it's a big topic, obviously. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Great talk. Everyone.
Nice to meet you.
Actually, I'm wondering, who and how defines atheism or atheism or defines so, is it self-defined or are people defined? Or Muslims in Central Asia still broadly, also in the context of the Korean users. Yeah. Quite a few people, especially this day, don't know the child capital or Sanskrit, related to Buddhism, but still, so many people still inclined to Buddhism, even though they are not a strict Buddhist or Confucian respect. Still, so I think that's all of the Confucian rituals they didn't care about capital or some Confucian sacrificial rituals according to the annual Confucius. So and then is there any some kind of the cultural or religious changes impact of sort of atheism or scientific knowledge, such as the Soviet era or the modern period?
Since we are coming to an end, can we take Tom's question as well?
Pilgrimages to saints' tombs. That is something that a government can regulate. Was that one of the, how were the pilgrimages treated in this literature of that you're examining? But
I had one more thing.
Yeah,
It
please.
occurred to me, maybe it's very obvious actually, but I was thinking that atheism was born as a basically political project, right? It's like an activism thing, right? And then it became a kind of scholarly pursuit. So we have this kind of movement from, what you described in the 30s, where the texts were lacking detail and they were very kind of, not based on like much knowledge and expertise, right? And then kind of as other fields in the Soviet Union, like the sciences were developing, right? Getting more established. So we see this kind of establishment of religious studies
Sure.
in the shape and form of atheist studies. That's why you have these people who actually write decent reports and studies. So anyways, okay,
That's
the
true.
floor is yours.
That's true. Well, I can't, possibly do justice to all these great questions. We'd be happy to talk after, since we're running out of time, we'd be happy to talk afterward about some of the great points you raised. But in terms of how they're defining atheism or defining Muslim, the latter I don't think there's really an answer to. or I don't have one yet. But the one consistent thing in terms of what does it mean to be an atheist is to not believe in the supernatural. That's the one thing that's where like E equals MC squared. That's where that kind of stuff is coming from. And I mean, I could off the top of my head give you 10 books written in Turkey at this time to do that argument as well, but they're not atheistic. But none of those books includes this kind of information. So there's something distinctive going on. And again, the sort of preoccupation with the supernatural is something that is bad. To say that they're really preoccupied with that, I wouldn't say it. That's not really the main argument. But when they do talk about, or when they do allude to what it is to be an atheist, it primarily relates to that. And of course, the official Muftiyyat is making the exact same argument at the same time, saying that to be a Muslim, to be a modern Muslim, is to not believe in the supernatural. You know, some of the popular manifestations of that in Central Asia are things like the Salatul Istisqa, the prayer for rain, which is regarded as an un-Islamic innovation. The term bid'at is an Islamic term referring to a innovation unsanctioned by the Sunnah. So they actually, I have one guy, he translates one of Khrushchev's speeches into Uzbek, and he uses the term bid'at. He attributes that term to Khrushchev. There's no way Khrushchev could have used that term. The term, there's no Russian, when Russian scholars use that term today, they use the word bid'at. They say the bid'ati, because there's no way Khrushchev used this term. So they're actually, you know, they're injecting this sort of very Islamic understanding of what superstition is, even attributing it to Soviet leaders to back themselves up. So that's kind of how I would think about the atheism. Yeah, on the academic, absolutely. And the academic is a big part of it, for sure. But there's also a polemical aspect that is not academic. Right. So it's not like it's just like an academic body, though that becomes more prominent as time goes on, I think.
That's what I mean, the transformation. So you see the kind of some leftovers of the kind of pamphlet, like, you know, propaganda, the more scholarly undertaking. So
and most of them are scholars.
Interesting things.
True. Yeah, they're not scholars of Islamic studies, but they are scholars of various shades. So that is definitely something to grapple with. On the pilgrimage, Tom, yeah.
I mean, you have the source telling people where to go.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, listing the shrines, but
that is really something they don't want to talk about, except this one Tajik source I've got, which was in, you know, published in a hardcover edition, which is very unusual, in only 5,000 copies, where they are actually describing very openly how, you know, every time you pass by this shrine, there are people there praying and that kind of thing, which you don't get in the Uzbek text. So it's, you know, I haven't been able to do justice in this time to the fact that, I mean, this is a diverse body of literature. You know, they're not all the same. They're all doing different kinds of things. And some of them shed more light on certain practices than others. But in general, pilgrimage is a silence. They're not talking about it very much. Yeah, probably for understandable reasons. Because it's one of those things that really...
But they're not trying to hinder it, sounds like, in terms of official policy.
You mean the state?
State.
They're hindering some shrines, the really popular ones, with like the rock concert followings. Yeah, they are clamping down on those ones. But even those ones are getting, you know, it's like from 100,000 pilgrims on Eagle Hut to like, you know, maybe 30,000 in the 60s and 70s. Still big numbers for an ostensibly anti-religious state. Yeah, and how all this has escaped the attention of historians who focus on Central Asia, and how we ended up with this idea of, you know, that the religion was repressed in this kind of unitary fashion, I don't know, because the sources are telling us a very different story. They're not describing religious freedom, but they're describing something that doesn't jive with my understanding of the term repression.
What's the point of your thesis?
I guess so, yeah.
Well, yes, Central Asian Studies, that's sort of semi-virgin field, right? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Eren.
Thank you for coming.